I'm here for a simple reason that over the last number of years, it's become obvious that many of our staff in nature conservation bodies don't have a great deal of institutional knowledge. I'm also here because I'm a born-again believer in sustainable use, and that's very selfish because without sustainable use, we wouldn't have anything to eat. That's whether you're a vegan or whether you're a vegan. I might add, I have a more biological description because often the term veganism is confused with being a conservationist. And I would like to say that I don't quite agree with that. I respect anyone who wants to be a vegan, but that makes you, in my scientific things, a herbivore and not a conservationist. Because the impact of the mass monoculture that has developed around the world in order to keep us alive, or even the great tunnels that we have all over the country growing chickens for KFC, are all having a huge negative impact on the biodiversity of this earth. So I don't think being any particular choice of article on your menu makes you a conservationist. What you do with your life, focusing on conservation, is what gives you standing. Otherwise, you're just a herbivore if you're a vegan. Now, what I would like to do, I'm going to take you through just over 100 years of conservation work in this province, because you happen to be in KZN, and therefore we feel that we've got a bit of a chance. It's taken us 100 years of effort to try to repair for our wildlife animals, our large mammals in particular. It's taken us over 100 years to get them back to somewhere they were back in the days before this country of ours was settled. In fact, South Africa survived. Once the settlers had got here, South Africa moved away from the normal indigenous people living in balance with nature to the point where we began to overexploit it. And for the next 350 years, and that included everyone in South Africa, it was get your hands on wildlife. Every farmer had a gun. Guns were the result of Nkosi Langlebelela getting involved in a rebellion, and he was using them to shoot eland in the Drakensberg as well. So it is a fairly universal combined effort by South Africans as a whole to wipe out our large mammal resources. And I'm going to take you through that quickly. Okay, by 1895, all the animals scheduled on this image were on the verge of extinction. We were down to 17 black wildebeest. We were down to probably between 30 and 50 white rhino, and probably the same black rhino. Hippos were a bit better in St. Lucia because swimming wasn't a popular activity in those days, and it was quite difficult to hunt them. But for the main, virtually all of these animals are gone. And we have some here simply to thank some private sector farmers who kept them on their properties rather than see them wiped out. So we have Bontebok in the Cape that were looked after by one private sector farmer. We have the mountain zebra, which were looked after by one farmer, and we have the black wildebeest, which were looked after by one farmer. Black wildebeest, the lowest they got to was 17. That was the world population of the day. Now, all sorts of people got involved. Around 1895 here in KZN, we was the first province to set aside protected areas specifically for mammals. So in 1895, we had Shashui, Umfolozi, and St. Lucia put aside. And the men who looked after these places were underpaid, underprivileged, ignored, and they lived from hand to mouth. But they were South Africans. They weren't anyone in particular, and it's thanks to these people that we have some of these animals. Now, there are a lot of dramatic stories about who saved wildlife and who saved the white rhino. The people who saved the white rhino were the Natal colony politicians who set aside Umfolozi Game Reserve. The more modern saviors of those people came when we already had 600 in Umfolozi. That was an operation and not a saving. There's a difference. And so these are the people that we really owe. Alfeus spent nearly 50 years working for nature conservation, ending up in the Natal Parks Board, and it's to people like him and the incredible loyalty that they gave us in conservation. We came with a strange concept of looking after wildlife. Fortunately, in Zululand, we had communities who had known that there was a degree of conservation carried out by King Shaka. Granted, it was a little difficult. It was like the Chinese methods of dealing with corrupt officials. You take them down to the sports ground, and then you shoot them. In those days, it was different. The first person we began to get, thanks to those gentlemen, we began to have too many animals in our parks. In fact, we started to shoot them. We shot everything that we felt was overrunning its habitat, and we fed them to staff. We gave them away to locals, but it was not a very sensible position to take. Because we didn't have any skills in this. And the first person to say, listen, we must make these animals available, put them back on farms and stuff, was Peter Potter. And he started the first really efficient game capture operation, catching impala and mkuzi. And you would go out in a short wheelbase Land Rover with all the staff hanging onto the side. They'd drive into a herd of impala, and everyone would jump off and grab the impala at whatever point past them, which could have been quite painful for the odd male impala. And then we then started to make these available, and we marketed these by saying people could come and collect impala. Just bring a bucky and a decent cage and you could have them. And nobody came. And the following year, strange things, human beings, and the following year we put a price of R1.50 on an impala, and since then we've never been able to supply the demand. So it's very, very strange indeed. And then following that, we then, the Natal Parks Board then started a farm game extension service where we had specialist staff and scientists who went out to go and talk to people who had land to try to persuade them to put wildlife back that was compatible with their farming practice. Going to the sugarcane area and suggesting they put an elephant, not a very sensible thing to do. But there were other things that could be looked after and bought and moved there, which would broaden our biodiversity and especially our large mammal base. And we stuck in mainly with the more common species, and Yala has become incredibly popular. The blesbuck, these are on the retirement estate where I live, two the most contented blesbuck in the world. And in the Drakensberg, we used to go out. It was still the Wild West era. When I worked in the Drakensberg, we all ran around on foot or on horseback, and we used to go and catch calves on horseback, which riding around in the Drakensberg is quite an exciting venture, allow me to assure you. And at one stage, we even, thanks to Professor Abbott from the University of Natal in those days, we even created our own eland herd at Loteni, which regrettably did not come to fruition because Professor Abbott retired and our scientific officer, Rudy Bigalki, at the stage moved on to greener pastures. Wildebeest, I have mentioned. There are now about 50 or 60,000 of them in South Africa, so we have a great deal to thank the farmer for. Red Hartebeest, the same thing. Red Hartebeest and black wildebeest used to feature every year on the exports from the colony of Natal. They were there because the colony of Natal depended on the sale of products like hides. And we know exactly when the red hartebeest went extinct in the province, because Colonel Vincent, our then director, we had 3 red hartebeest left in the wild in South Africa, on a farm near Greytown, and Colonel Vincent announced that they were going to capture them and put them into one of our protected areas, and a conservation-minded farmer went out and shot all 3 that night. So nature conservation, ons was bekend as die Natalse Varkeraad in those days. We did not get on well with the farmers. They saw nature conservation bodies being imposing on the natural freedom of farmers and stuff. So it was a difficult period, and perhaps the term Varkeraad was probably earned. Anyway, in 1954, in May, the last of the hartebeest, and it fell to my lot and some of my colleagues to go to the Northern Cape and bring him back again. And so we brought 22 calves back and from the Northern Cape, and we started introducing them back into our province, and they have now done very well. Then came the Rhino Saga. Ian Player, who was then the chief conservator in Zululand, he said we had too many white rhino in Umfolozi, and he said, get on with it, we must try to capture them. Unfortunately, Colonel Vincent was aware of Tony Harthorn, who was a veterinarian working in Uganda, trying to use drugs to capture hippo. And the colonel invited him to come down, and with him came the means whereby we could catch white rhino. It was really, he had a tremendous role, Tony Harthorn, in making it possible for us to move rhino. Then came the helicopter, and alas, all the shenanigans that we had in the Drakensberg on horseback, and Ian and Nick and co in the Zululand chasing around after drugged rhino on horseback, all that came to an end. This was a game changer in wildlife conservation around South Africa as a whole. And the white rhino was no exception. It enabled us to sharpen up our ability to get these animals. And in one peak season, due to a drought, we removed over 650 white rhino from Umfolozi alone. So, and it could be done. We could take them out up to 20 a day. It was an amazing project. And so there we have it. That was the world population in 1895. We have exported them all over the world. We have been able to move them. We have got them onto auctions. We have, they have become an incredibly important component of the economy of nature conservation in this province and indeed in other provinces. Now, we get a lot of criticism from Kenya because for some obscure reason, everybody in Europe and America thinks that the home of conservation is Kenya. And whenever anyone wants to know about nature conservation, they consult a Kenyan. And they say, right, Kenya says, we don't like this. We don't like that. We're not happy about South Africa because our game reserves are fenced, which wasn't the case back in the 70s in Kenya. It is now, I might add, but not in the 70s. In the 70s, we had quite a dramatic change. Here, we were suddenly getting, the communities were coming on board, predominantly the white farming community, and they wanted to start with conservancies, and then but we took the decision to try to get more wildlife and to give more freedom to landowners to use wildlife, all part of the sustainable use program. And what happened was that at the same time, Kenya took the decision that they were not going to allow any form of commercial utilization of their wildlife. So they stopped the great hunting industry, which was all part of the law of Africa in those days. And the net result has been what has happened to our rhino population under a sustainable use regime has gone right up. This is now up in the 20,000, and this is what's happened in Kenya. And the amazing part is that nearly all the rhino in Kenya all come from South Africa. Then we were very fortunate to get Jan Olofse joining us, and he developed the Boma type capture for other animals, and they were marvelous because we managed to eventually get it so well we could capture game, put them straight into the truck without being touched by human hand. This was a very considerable difference to chasing them after them in a Land Rover. Giraffe were caught the same way, and for those of you that don't know a great deal about giraffe, you may ponder on the fact that there were no giraffe in this province, and there are quite considerable debates as to whether they ever did occur here. But as a result of them being popular animals, they've been introduced, and they're now one of the most common animals in our Thornfeld game reserves. And as a result, we developed the Game Capture Center, primarily to deal with rhino, but with all other species. And then the private sector started game auctions. And they weren't particularly well run. They were held at Sun City, so there was a great deal of jollification and undoubtedly drinking, and a lot of animals died during the course of this. And Keith Micklejohn here was our head of our game capture. He went up and studied these, came back and gave us a set of recommendations, including that we should run our own auction in KZN. And we started the game auction, Natal Game Auction as it was then, Natal Passport Game Auction, and it became regarded as the champagne game auction of the world. It could demand the highest prices because of the quality of the game and the skills that had been developed by the game capture team in this province. And it really attracted a huge amount of attention. And at that stage, the people of the province and much of South Africa were 100% behind the policy of sustainable use. It didn't matter what we put onto the auction. If we put on some of the rarer things like red duiker and others, well, the prices were just ridiculous. And the nicest thing to have is a big kudu bull that licks the farmer's wife. They tame very quickly. So if you get a farmer's wife coming along, gets licked by a big kudu bull with horns, magnificent creature, man, the price of that spikes during the auction. Absolutely one of the great, this is the biodiversity economy of all biodiversity economy. Right. And then we brought on the black rhino, and that received a lot of criticism. Dr. John Ledger, a good friend and colleague, despite the fact of the day, he immediately criticized us by saying, what did we mean putting black rhino on? What were we going to do about the genetics? Well, as we started off with only about 40 black rhino in the province, there isn't a great deal we can do about the genetics. It isn't something you can go down to the chemist and buy a bottle of genetics. So we have to act in good faith. The trouble is a number of Americans would apologize to my colleague from the United States who came up, Simbaloff and Co., who came up with the most incredible numbers about what you had to have in the way of 50,000 active breeding animals in a herd in order to prevent genetic drift. Well, he seems to have missed a few things, like Indian miners in South Africa. 4 were brought in from India. The well-known Rhodes, Cecil John Rhodes of University of Cape Town fame, he brought in 6 grey squirrels, and we haven't noticed any genetic drift in our squirrel population. And if you go to New Zealand and you see red deer, Fraser Darling would be absolutely delighted, because they brought in 1 load of red deer into New Zealand, and they have colonized the whole of South Island. There's a massive industry involved in removing red deer, and no sign yet of genetic drift after nearly 100 years. So these animals have done very well. We put them on the auction. You could bid on 1, and you had to take 6. And these 2 gentlemen, Dale Parker and Clive Walker from Lapalala Reserve, paid 440,000 rand each for 6. So the reason why I was smiling that day, it was a huge income for the organization. Now, we have been doing this since Ian started to catch white rhino, and Peter started to catch impala and other species, and all told, here's just a sample. We take off about 3,500 head of game per year, surplus game from KwaZulu-Natal parks. And over the time that we have been doing this, we have probably put 250,000 animals into the Greater South Africa. And from that, the numbers have gone exponential. And the figures vary considerably. The EWT did a review a couple of years ago, Mr. Taylor, and he came up for a sample from some of the commercial private sector parks to say that there were about 4 million on those. And if you take all the other areas in Natal that are now in South Africa that are now stocked with wildlife, the figure of around about 20 million is not a bad one. It is absolutely incredible what has been done in this country with our wildlife. Our wildlife industry today, including tourism, etc., is probably moving up towards the 500 billion rand a year. This is a phenomenal amount of money being brought in. The wildlife industry has grown dramatically. It is growing at about 9.3, and I'd like to acknowledge Lizanne Nell, who unfortunately can't be here today, for her contribution to this. And of course, as a result of all these skills in this province, our old game capture center began topsy to grow and get a bit old, so we built a new one, built on the skills learnt by our game capture teams. And the bottom line is that we built a new game capture center in Mfolozi, and in 2005 the state produced a new Bureau of Standards publication on the care and handling of wildlife. And the care and handling of wildlife in South Africa is based entirely on what your conservation body did in this province. Speak a bit closer. All right. Okay, and with it we built, we ensured that our local community was totally involved in the planning and building in this, and they have a very successful curio shop there. Hunting, we see and always have seen hunting as a perfectly legitimate form of wildlife utilization. It is part of the conservation scene, and what we should be concerned about is not that it exists, but that where it does exist, it is run according to the law. That is our job. The other things you move off. We added hunting areas to the protected areas in this province, and we have a very successful hunting industry. But hunters are having a problem because the Department of Environment Affairs has begun to produce so many regulations, etc., that it is beginning to impact on the people wanting to come and hunt in this country. And we are losing out to Namibia. We're actually finding we're getting a drop in hunters coming to South Africa, and the new regulation that have just been published as possibly to be implemented soon is simply awe-inspiring. You have to have a doctorate to fill in the forms, and you have to have an officer from DEA with every hunt, and that is impractical and nonsensical. So I hope that there are people going to make it a great deal easier and more welcoming for people to come to hunt in South Africa. Now, they banned hunting in Botswana a short while ago. This was not a good idea, and for those of you that who can read here, you will see that huge amounts of money and jobs have been lost in the first 12 months following the ban. And it's got worse since this paper has only just been published, but since this is 2 years out of date as far as the data is concerned. And I'm now delighted to hear that Botswana are considering reintroducing hunting, but hopefully in a more sensible manner. And I mentioned Kenya. Kenya, who is consulted by everyone as to why we shouldn't shoot rhino, why we shouldn't trade in horn, etc., all comes from Kenya. Negative. They always lead the charge against sustainable use. And here is a publication coming out from Brian Child shortly. And if you look at the lower rate here, up to 80% of their individual species have gone in the last 30 years. Kenya's wildlife is dropping at a phenomenal rate. And you compare this with South Africa, which is all going the opposite way, with a huge increase in land being committed to a conservation base, an effective conservation measure. I think it's a bit of a cheek for Kenya to keep turning around and pointing figures at us. If you look here, Kenya has lost, according to this graph, it was up until now 67% of all of its wildlife. South Africa has increased our wildlife by 645, and I think this figure is wrong. I think that we have actually increased wildlife, large mammal populations in this country by 1,000%. So it's a phenomenal achievement. Now, here in KZN, formally we have nearly 9% of the province formally protected, 2 World Heritage Sites. We have 28% of the coastline, which is way above the international target. And then we also had, in addition, conservancies, natural heritage sites, stewardship program now. All other effective conservation measures are now being recognized by IUCN as additional conservation land. And so South Africa has screamed past the 10% that was once spoken. And now I'm delighted to say, following the biodiversity movements of the state, in the marine areas, we have just increased our marine protected areas through the Pakisa program to 5% with a goal of 20% in due course. And I think South Africans should be extremely proud of the direction that we are still going on in South Africa. Now, any conservation body should have 3 legs to its stool. It should know what it's doing. Our job is biodiversity conservation. Our job is not to worry about whether Vietnam smokes rhino horn. That's not our department, with the greatest of respect. We are not here to start acting as some sort of moral guardians for other countries. It's for other countries to look after their things exactly as we do in South Africa for our own people. We should ensure that all people are involved. No question. The chairman of the board mentioned that earlier, and we have certainly had a community outreach program from which many of our members, many of our communities have benefited, as I'll show you in a moment. And you cannot forget economics. good agencies require funds to do anything properly. And so you cannot overlook that. Tourism, we have certainly looked at this problem. There's Giant's Castle Camp, for those of you that know the Drakensberg in the 1950s. Not the most aesthetic site I've ever seen, but a brilliant achievement. That is Giant's Castle Camp today. It's an absolutely magnificent facility of which this country will be immensely proud. And we have put in rock art centres to a window, the wonderful rock art that we have in the Drakensberg. I might add that just this morning there was a notice on News 24 to say that Kazakhstan is going to do better than we are because of their rock art. Well, two things were wrong. Firstly, they said, look at the Cederberg and look at Kazakhstan. Well, Cederberg has got, they only have single color rock art in the Cederberg. It's all red or black. Here in the Tal Drakensberg sand, have blended color. The only place in the world where rock art people actually blended colors and produced the beautiful polychrome paintings. They are absolutely magnificent. And do you see it advertised in South Africa? No. But if you go to Australia, everything you see about Australia is prefixed by a big lump of red rock with absolutely no biodiversity on it, called Ayers Rock. And they market it every time an Australian speaks. We should be learning. In the Zululand areas, we have done huge, wonderful camps that we've developed. And we also, people tend to forget, Black South Africans served on the board of the Natal Parks Board and Ezemvelo, KwaZulu-Natal from 1977. That was long before it was politically correct. And we were, people like Nkosi Gumede told us what the local people wanted. So funds were raised for the local communities, millions of rand that we raised outside of the park. We permitted resources to be collected in the parks of KwaZulu-Natal. And we collected, millions of rand were collected by our people. If you go to Zululand today, hands up those who last saw a traditional Zulu muzi made of thatch in any of the homelands, any of Ngonyama Trust land. And because the only place you can get decent thatch is inside the protected areas of Zululand. The rest has all been wiped out by too many cattle. Tourism levy we brought in for our communities. 38 million rand has been paid out from our tourism levy over the last 20 years. It is a phenomenally successful program, and it has certainly, we have not overlooked the community. And people write, and they say that the people who are worried about dehorning rhino, people are getting no benefits. We have the Gumbi community in Zululand who have to dehorn their rhino to try to cut down on poaching, and all that resource is lying there wasted. It's not just the private sector who is losing out as a result of this. It's our local people as well. So thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your time.